The magic is fading. You might not notice it at first, the way color drains so slowly from a photograph left too long in sunlight. You're sitting in your perfectly organized apartment, scrolling through your phone at 2 a.m., surrounded by every convenience modernity promised would make you happy, and yet you feel nothing. Maybe it's the hollow ache that settles in your chest when you realize another weekend passed in the same routine, productive but empty. Maybe it's the way you can't remember the last time something truly moved you, really shook you awake with wonder or meaning. Or maybe it's just the creeping sense that life has become a series of optimized transactions, measurable outcomes and rational choices, none of which touch the part of you that hungers for something more. And without words, something ancient within you recognizes the truth. If I don't find enchantment in this world again, then what was the point of surviving this long? This is what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world, and it may be the most profound diagnosis of modern suffering ever articulated. Because Weber wasn't just describing a philosophical problem. He was identifying a psychological crisis that reshapes how millions of people experience reality itself, turning existence from a sacred journey into a mechanical process, from a mystery to be lived into a problem to be solved. When Weber introduced this concept in his lectures on science as a vocation in 1917, he was witnessing what he believed to be an irreversible transformation in human consciousness. The transition from a world filled with gods, spirits, meaning and magic to a world governed by calculation, efficiency, measurement, and cold rationality. He observed that as societies rationalized, as they replaced myth with method and enchantment with explanation, something essential was lost. Not just belief in supernatural forces, but the very capacity to experience life as inherently meaningful, as infused with purpose beyond what can be quantified or controlled. This wasn't progress to Weber. It was tragedy dressed in the language of advancement. And if you feel that tragedy in your bones, if you sense that something vital has been extracted from existence itself, you're not broken or ungrateful, or incapable of appreciating modern life. You're experiencing what Weber predicted would be the defining spiritual crisis of rationalized civilization. Today, I'm going to reveal 5 hidden signs that you're carrying the weight of disenchantment. Markers so subtle that most people never recognize them as symptoms of a deeper civilizational transformation. And more importantly, I'll show you what Weber believed about whether we can recover enchantment, or whether we're condemned to live in what he called the iron cage of rationality forever. The first sign is one that most people mistake for maturity or realism, but Weber would recognize it immediately as a symptom of disenchantment. You've lost the capacity for genuine wonder. Not childlike naivety or irrational belief, but the ability to encounter reality with reverence, to feel that there's something more happening beneath the surface of things than mere material processes. You walk through a forest and see resources to be managed or carbon to be sequestered. You meet another person and immediately categorize them by profession, usefulness, potential value to your network. You experience a moment of beauty, a sunset or a piece of music, and within seconds you're analyzing it, explaining it, posting it, turning it into content rather than simply receiving it as gift. Weber called this the intellectualization of existence, the tendency of rationalized consciousness to reduce everything to its functional components, to strip away the numinous quality that once made the world feel alive with purpose. Because in pre-modern societies, Weber observed, people didn't just see objects and organisms. They saw manifestations of deeper spiritual realities. A tree wasn't merely cellulose and chlorophyll. It was a dwelling place for spirits, a symbol of cosmic order, a participant in sacred cycles of death and rebirth. An illness wasn't just a biological malfunction. It was a message from the gods, a karmic consequence, a spiritual test. Every aspect of existence was embedded in webs of meaning that transcended utilitarian function. But rationalization systematically destroys these webs. Science explains the tree's biology, reducing it to mechanical processes. Medicine diagnoses the illness, transforming mystery into treatable pathology. Economics prices the forest, converting sacred space into real estate value. And with each explanation, each calculation, each reduction to measurable components, the enchantment drains away. You gain control and predictability. but you lose the sense that existence means something beyond what you can manipulate or understand. If you've noticed that nothing moves you anymore the way things once did, that your emotional range has narrowed to mild satisfaction or vague dissatisfaction, that you can't remember the last time you felt genuine awe or sacred presence, this isn't just depression or burnout. It's your consciousness adapting to a disenchanted world, learning to see reality the way rationalized systems teach you to see it, as raw material for optimization rather than mystery to be honored. And here's the paradox Weber identified. This loss of wonder doesn't make you more rational or more mature. It makes you more hollow. Because human beings aren't designed to live in a universe stripped of inherent meaning. We're meaning-making creatures who need to feel that our lives participate in something larger than individual survival and success. When rationalization removes that larger context, when it tells you that meaning is just a neurochemical illusion and purpose is whatever you arbitrarily assign it to be, your soul begins to starve even as your material circumstances improve. The second sign reveals itself in how you make decisions, and it's one of the most insidious effects of living in a disenchanted world. You've replaced values with metrics. Every choice you face gets filtered through cost-benefit analysis, efficiency calculations, strategic positioning. Should I take this job? Well, what's the salary, the career trajectory, the resume value? Should I pursue this relationship? What are the compatibility percentages, the practical benefits, the opportunity costs? Should I spend time on this activity? What's the ROI, the productivity gain, the measurable outcome? Weber called this instrumental rationality, the dominance of means over ends, where you become obsessed with optimizing how you do things while losing sight of why you're doing them at all. In traditional societies, Weber observed, people oriented their actions around what he called value rationality. They made choices based on deeply held beliefs about what was sacred, what was honorable, what was right according to religious, ethical, or communal standards. A person might sacrifice economic advantage to maintain family honor, might choose poverty over compromising spiritual principles, might dedicate their life to a calling that offered no material reward but fulfilled what they believed to be their sacred duty. These weren't irrational choices. They were choices guided by a different kind of rationality, one that prioritized ultimate values over instrumental efficiency. But in disenchanted modernity, value rationality increasingly gives way to instrumental rationality. You stop asking what is right or meaningful and start asking what is effective or profitable. You stop choosing based on who you want to become and start choosing based on what will maximize measurable outcomes. The tragedy, Weber argued, is that instrumental rationality is perfectly logical within its own framework, but completely unable to answer the questions that actually matter to human flourishing. It can tell you the most efficient way to achieve a goal, but it cannot tell you which goals are worth pursuing. It can optimize your productivity, but it cannot tell you what you should be producing or why. It can maximize your income, but it cannot tell you what a well-lived life consists of. So you end up with people who are extraordinarily competent at achieving objectives they never consciously chose, who climb ladders propped against the wrong walls, who optimize their way into existential emptiness because they've lost access to the value rationality that could guide them toward genuine fulfillment. If you find yourself constantly calculating, always strategizing, unable to make a choice without consulting data or maximizing some metric, unable to justify doing something simply because it feels right or meaningful or beautiful, you're experiencing disenchantment at the level of decision-making itself. You've internalized the logic of rationalized systems so completely that you can no longer hear the voice of your own deeper values beneath the noise of efficiency optimization. And the cruel irony is that the more successful you become at instrumental rationality, the more lost you often feel. Because success by metrics that don't align with your soul's actual needs is just sophisticated failure, wearing the costume of achievement. The third sign appears in your relationship to work, and Weber would recognize it immediately as one of the most devastating consequences of living in a disenchanted world. You've confused your calling with your career, or more accurately, you've lost the very concept of calling altogether and replaced it with professional identity, economic function, resume optimization. Weber's analysis of the Protestant work ethic revealed something profoundly tragic about modern work culture. The original Protestant reformers, particularly Calvin, developed the idea of vocation, the belief that God called each person to a specific worldly occupation as a form of worship, that work was a sacred duty performed for divine glory rather than personal gain. This gave labor a transcendent meaning. You weren't just making shoes or trading goods or farming land. You were fulfilling your divine calling, participating in God's cosmic order, sanctifying creation through diligent service. But Weber observed what happened as societies rationalized and secularized. The religious content of calling evaporated, but the compulsion to work remained, intensified even, now stripped of its spiritual justification. What was once sacred duty became mere economic necessity or status competition or identity construction. You internalized the Protestant work ethic's demand for ceaseless productivity, but without any of the transcendent meaning that once made that demand bearable or even beautiful. So you work constantly, sacrificing health and relationships and joy, but not because you believe you're serving a higher purpose. You work because that's what successful people do, because productivity is how you prove your worth, because stopping feels like failure or waste or dangerous vulnerability. This creates what Weber called specialists without spirit, people who are highly skilled at their narrow functions, but completely disconnected from any larger sense of meaning or purpose. You excel at your job, you get promoted, you increase your productivity, but somewhere deep inside you know that none of it touches the hunger you carry for a life that matters beyond quarterly earnings or performance reviews. You've lost the concept of calling, the sense that your work connects you to something sacred or serves values that transcend economic exchange. Work becomes just another rationalized system you navigate for survival and status rather than a vocation that expresses who you are and contributes to what you believe the world needs. If you feel a profound disconnection between what you do for money and what you sense you're actually here to do, if your work feels like sophisticated slavery, even when it's well paid and respected, if you can't shake the feeling that you're wasting your one precious life on tasks that don't matter, you're experiencing the loss of calling in a disenchanted world. Because Weber understood that when work loses its sacred dimension, when it becomes merely instrumental rather than vocational, it loses its capacity to provide the deep fulfillment that makes the struggle of existence worthwhile. You can become very successful by external measures while remaining profoundly impoverished at the level of meaning and purpose. The fourth sign manifests in your inner life, in the quality of your thoughts and the texture of your consciousness, and it's one of the most overlooked symptoms of disenchantment. You've lost access to silence, to contemplation, to the kind of deep rest that isn't just absence of activity, but presence to mystery. Your mind never stops calculating, planning, analyzing, scrolling. You fill every moment with information consumption, with productivity, with stimulation. The idea of simply being, of sitting in stillness without purpose or agenda or outcome to optimize, feels impossible or wasteful or vaguely terrifying. Weber would see this as the psychological internalization of rationalized time, the transformation of temporal experience from cyclical sacred rhythm to linear economic resource. In traditional societies, Weber observed, time was structured around sacred calendars, around seasons and festivals and rituals that created spaces for contemplation, for rest, for reconnection with transcendent meaning. There were Sabbaths and feast days and pilgrimage seasons, times when ordinary productive activity ceased and people entered into different modes of consciousness, modes oriented toward the eternal rather than the urgent, toward communion rather than achievement. These weren't inefficient wastes of time. They were essential technologies for maintaining enchantment, for preventing consciousness from being completely colonized by instrumental concerns, for remembering that human beings are more than their economic functions. But in disenchanted modernity, time becomes something to be managed, maximized, monetized. Every hour must be accounted for. Every moment must produce measurable value. Rest becomes merely recuperation for future productivity, rather than sacred pause with inherent worth. Contemplation seems like luxury or indulgence available only to those who've already achieved enough to afford such inefficiency. You lose the rhythms that once created space for your consciousness to touch something beyond the grinding machinery of daily survival and status competition. And without those spaces, without those pauses, your inner life becomes increasingly shallow and frantic, colonized by the same instrumental logic that governs your external activities. If you find it nearly impossible to sit in silence without immediately reaching for your phone or planning your next task, if the idea of a day without productivity makes you anxious or guilty, if you can't remember the last time you simply contemplated existence without trying to solve or improve or optimize something, you're experiencing the loss of sacred time in a rationalized world. Because Weber understood that disenchantment doesn't just affect what you believe about the external world. It restructures your inner experience of consciousness itself, training you to experience your own mind as just another resource to be efficiently managed rather than a sacred space to be reverently inhabited. The fifth sign is perhaps the most painful and the most revealing, and it shows up in your relationship to suffering and meaning. You've lost the ability to make sense of pain, not to eliminate it or fix it or prevent it, but to integrate it into a larger narrative that gives it purpose or transforms it into something sacred. When you encounter suffering, whether your own or others, your only responses are problem-solving or despair, fixing or being crushed. You've lost access to what Weber called theodicy, the frameworks that once helped human beings understand why suffering exists and what it means within the cosmic order. Because in traditional religious worldviews, suffering wasn't just random meaningless pain. It was karmic consequence or divine test or spiritual purification or redemptive sacrifice. It participated in larger patterns of meaning that made even the most excruciating experiences bearable by connecting them to transcendent purposes. But rationalization systematically dismantles these meaning-making frameworks. Science tells you suffering is just biological malfunction or evolutionary accident. Psychology reduces it to trauma or chemical imbalance requiring treatment. Economics views it as inefficiency to be eliminated through better resource allocation. Each explanation is useful in its domain, but none of them answer the existential question that haunts you when you're actually in the midst of profound suffering. Why is this happening to me? What does this mean? How do I bear this without being destroyed by it? Disenchanted rationality has no satisfying answers to these questions because it has eliminated the very categories, purpose, sacred meaning, cosmic justice, that would make such answers possible. So when suffering arrives, and it always does, you're left with two equally inadequate options. Either you attempt to rationally solve the suffering, to eliminate it through technique and intervention, which works sometimes but fails catastrophically when facing the kinds of suffering that cannot be solved, only endured, or you descend into nihilistic despair, concluding that the pain is meaningless, that existence itself is a cruel joke, that there's no point to any of it. What you've lost is the middle path that traditional theodicies provided, the ability to face suffering without either denying its reality or being annihilated by its apparent meaninglessness, the capacity to say, "This is terrible and I don't understand it fully, but I trust that it participates in patterns larger than my comprehension, that it can be transformed into wisdom or compassion or depth, that bearing it with dignity is itself a sacred act." If you find yourself either frantically trying to fix every source of pain in your life or collapsing into hopelessness when confronted with suffering you can't eliminate, if you've lost the ability to grieve with grace or endure with purpose, if pain feels like nothing more than senseless torment to be avoided at all costs, you're experiencing the loss of sacred frameworks for making meaning from suffering. Because Weber understood that when rationalization strips away the religious and mythological narratives that once helped people integrate suffering into comprehensible worldviews, it leaves them profoundly vulnerable to being destroyed by the very experiences that might have deepened and strengthened them within a more enchanted cosmos. Now, before we go further, I want to pause and ask you something directly. As you've been listening to these signs, have you recognized yourself in them? Have you felt that uncomfortable recognition of truths you've been carrying but couldn't name? If so, I want you to know something crucial. This isn't just your personal pathology or individual weakness. This is the shared condition of countless people trying to build meaningful lives in a civilization that has systematically eliminated the frameworks that once made meaning possible. You're not broken. You're disenchanted. And recognizing that distinction is the first step toward something that might feel like recovery or transformation. If these ideas are resonating with you, If you're hungry for more depth in understanding how to navigate life in a disenchanted world, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel. This is a space dedicated to exploring these profound questions, to recovering wisdom that modernity has discarded, to finding paths toward re-enchantment that don't require you to abandon reason or pretend the modern world doesn't exist. Hit that subscribe button and join a community of people who refuse to accept disenchantment as the final word on human possibility. But here's where Weber's analysis becomes both more disturbing and strangely liberating. Because Weber didn't believe that disenchantment could be reversed through simple nostalgia or willful belief. You can't just decide to believe in gods you know don't exist, or embrace mythologies you've intellectually outgrown. The rationalization of the world is, for Weber, an irreversible historical process. Once the gods have been driven from the sacred groves by scientific explanation, they don't return just because you miss the enchantment they once provided. Once you've learned to see the world as governed by impersonal natural laws rather than personal divine will, you can't unknow that vision even if it makes existence feel colder and emptier. This was Weber's iron cage, the recognition that modern rationalized civilization creates systems of such overwhelming power and pervasiveness that escaping them becomes nearly impossible, that they shape consciousness so completely that even recognizing the cage is an achievement, let alone breaking free. So if enchantment can't be recovered through naive return to pre-modern beliefs, what options remain for people who carry the weight of disenchantment? Weber identified two primary responses that he saw among the intellectuals and spiritual seekers of his time, and both contain profound dangers. The first response is what he called value polytheism, the recognition that in a disenchanted world, there are multiple competing value systems, multiple gods, so to speak, none of which can claim absolute authority, all of which make legitimate but mutually exclusive demands on human loyalty. You might value scientific truth and artistic beauty and ethical justice and personal authenticity and collective solidarity, but these values often conflict. Pursuing one means sacrificing others. There's no higher authority, no cosmic order, no sacred hierarchy to tell you which value should take precedence. You're thrown back on your own choice, your own decision about which God you will serve, and you must make that choice knowing it's fundamentally arbitrary from any objective standpoint. This can lead to a kind of heroic decisionism, the attitude that says, I will choose my values and commit to them absolutely, not because they're cosmically validated, but because they're mine, because commitment itself has dignity even in a meaningless universe. Weber seemed to respect this stance, this willingness to choose and commit without metaphysical guarantees. But he also recognized its profound loneliness and instability, because when you know your values are chosen rather than discovered, when you recognize them as personal preference rather than objective truth, how do you sustain commitment when they're tested? How do you avoid the creeping suspicion that your most cherished beliefs are just arbitrary selections in a cosmic void? This path can lead to a certain strength and clarity, but it can also lead to exhaustion, to the constant burden of creating meaning ex nihilo in a universe that provides no scaffolding for your constructions. The second response Weber observed was what he called the flight to the mystical, the attempt to recover enchantment through direct spiritual experience, through cultivation of altered states of consciousness or contemplative practices or esoteric traditions that claim access to realities beyond rational comprehension. This was becoming increasingly popular in Weber's time, as it is in ours. The turn to Eastern philosophies, to meditation, to psychedelics, to various forms of experiential spirituality that promise to reconnect you with the sacred dimensions that rationalization has obscured. Weber was skeptical of this path, not because he denied the reality of mystical experiences, but because he questioned whether such experiences could actually provide sustainable meaning in the midst of rationalized social systems. You might have profound insights during meditation or peak experiences during ritual, but then you return to a world of bureaucracies and markets and technologies that function according to completely different logics, and the question becomes, how do you integrate those moments of enchantment into a life that must be lived primarily in disenchanted institutions? The danger Weber saw was that the mystical response often becomes a form of escapism, a private retreat from the rationalized world, rather than a transformation of it. You create little islands of enchantment, your yoga practice or your psychedelic ceremonies or your meditation retreats. But these remain separate from and largely irrelevant to the massive rationalized systems that actually govern social existence. Your mystical experiences don't change how corporations operate or how bureaucracies function, or how markets allocate resources. They provide personal solace, but don't address the civilizational crisis of disenchantment. And so you end up compartmentalized, living a double life where your private spiritual experiences exist in one realm, while your public professional existence continues in another, and the two never truly integrate. So here's the paradox Weber leaves us with. Disenchantment cannot be reversed through intellectual decision or willful belief. Value polytheism offers existential freedom, but no grounding beyond personal choice. Mystical experience provides moments of re-enchantment, but struggles to transform rationalized systems. What then? Is there any path that doesn't end in either heroic but unsupported decisionism, or escapist but ultimately privatized mysticism? Weber himself didn't provide a clear answer, and I think that's because he believed the question might not have a satisfying solution, at least not yet, not in his time. But I want to suggest something that emerges from Weber's analysis, even if he didn't explicitly articulate it, something that might offer a third path between naive nostalgia and resigned acceptance of permanent disenchantment. What if the task isn't to recover the enchantment of pre-modern worlds, which is impossible, or to create private islands of meaning in a disenchanted sea, which is inadequate, but to discover new forms of enchantment that can exist within and even utilize the very rationalization that seems to preclude them? What if rationalization and enchantment aren't absolute opposites, but can enter into more complex relationships? Consider this. Weber observed that rationalization eliminates certain forms of enchantment, particularly those based on superstition, ignorance, or wish fulfillment. But might rationalization also make possible new forms of enchantment? Enchantments based on deeper understanding rather than surface magic, on awe at the actual complexity of reality rather than projection of human desires onto nature? When you truly understand the evolutionary processes that created consciousness, when you grasp the quantum mechanics underlying material reality, when you comprehend the ecological webs that sustain life, are you necessarily less enchanted than someone who saw nature as populated by spirits? Or might you be differently enchanted, touched by wonder at the actual mechanisms through which the universe becomes aware of itself, rather than comforted by anthropomorphic explanations? This is the possibility Weber glimpsed but didn't fully develop, that disenchantment might be a necessary phase, a stripping away of false enchantments that must occur before more mature enchantments become possible. The pre-modern world was enchanted partly through ignorance, through not understanding how things actually work, through projecting meaning onto processes that operated according to very different logics than human consciousness could comprehend. As rationalization revealed those actual mechanisms, the projected meanings dissolved. But what if that dissolution creates space for encountering reality as it actually is, in all its terrible beauty and overwhelming complexity, and finding that encounter itself enchanting in ways that don't require delusion or denial? This would be what we might call conscious enchantment. Enchantment that doesn't rest on false beliefs or comforting fictions, but on deep engagement with the actual mystery of existence. Mystery not in the sense of things we don't understand yet, though there's plenty of that, but mystery in the sense of realities that transcend complete comprehension, even as we understand more and more about them. The fact that matter organizes itself into consciousness. The fact that meaning emerges from meaningless physical processes. The fact that love and beauty and purpose arise in a universe that seems fundamentally indifferent to human concerns. These aren't mysteries that science will eventually dispel. They're mysteries that deepen as understanding increases, paradoxes at the heart of existence that rational inquiry reveals rather than eliminates. If you can learn to live in those mysteries, to let them enchant you without needing them to be explained away or to provide metaphysical comfort, you might find a form of enchantment that doesn't require you to abandon rationality or retreat into private mysticism or exhaust yourself creating meaning from nothing. You might discover that the universe as it actually is, when truly encountered rather than explained away or projected upon, is more enchanting than any of the gods or myths or meaning frameworks that humanity created, when it didn't yet understand how reality operates. But this requires something incredibly difficult. It requires what Weber called intellectual integrity, the courage to face reality without the protective shields of wishful thinking or comforting delusions, and to find in that naked encounter itself something worthy of reverence. Most people can't sustain that stance. It's too demanding, too uncomfortable, too devoid of the psychological securities that traditional enchantments provided. And so they retreat into either the instrumental rationality that Weber described, accepting disenchantment and just optimizing their way through meaningless existence, or into various forms of re-enchantment that require them to believe things they don't actually find credible. But for those rare individuals who can hold the tension, who can live fully in the rationalized world while remaining open to the genuine mysteries that rationalization reveals rather than eliminates, a different possibility emerges. Not the recovery of lost enchantment, but the discovery of an enchantment adequate to our actual circumstances, grounded in truth rather than illusion, sustainable precisely because it doesn't require you to deny what you know. This is the path Weber points toward without quite articulating it, and it's the path I believe offers the most hope for those of us carrying the weight of disenchantment in the early 21st century. Because we can't go back to the gods of our ancestors. We know too much. We've seen too clearly how those sacred stories function to organize societies and manage anxieties and create solidarity. But we also can't resign ourselves to permanent disenchantment, to lives of pure instrumental rationality devoid of reverence or wonder or sacred purpose. We need a third option, and that option emerges when we stop treating rationalization as the enemy of enchantment and start seeing it as a discipline that can prepare consciousness for encounters with reality that are genuinely enchanting precisely because they're true. Let me give you a concrete example of what this might look like in practice. Imagine you're struggling with the question of your life's purpose, your calling in Weber's sense. The pre-modern response would be to consult religious authorities, to receive your vocation from tradition or divine revelation or communal assignment. The disenchanted modern response is either to choose arbitrarily from available career options based on income and status, pure instrumental rationality, or to seek purpose through various self-help frameworks that amount to creating your own meaning through positive thinking and goal setting. Neither is satisfying. The first isn't available to those who can't sincerely believe in the religious frameworks. The second leaves you either empty or exhausted from constant self-creation. But the third path would involve something different. You would use rational analysis, deep honest assessment of your actual capacities and inclinations and values, combined with empirical observation of real needs in the world. But you would approach that analysis not as mere calculation, but as a form of contemplation, as a way of listening for where your particular configuration of gifts and the world's particular configuration of needs might intersect in something that feels like calling. You wouldn't receive that calling from external authority, and you wouldn't arbitrarily invent it. You would discover it through rigorous attention to what is actually true about yourself and the world, and that discovery would have the quality of revelation, of grace, not because it came from supernatural sources, but because it emerged from deep alignment between inner truth and outer reality. This is what I mean by conscious enchantment. You're using all the tools of rationality, self-knowledge, empirical observation, clear analysis, but you're orienting them toward encounter with genuine mystery, the mystery of your own unique existence and its potential relationship to larger patterns of meaning. And when you find those moments of alignment, they're enchanting not because you've projected meaning onto meaningless reality, but because you've discovered meaning that was actually there, latent, waiting to be recognized and activated through conscious choice and committed action. The same principle applies to every aspect of life in a disenchanted world. Relationships. You don't need to believe in soulmates or cosmic destiny to experience love as sacred. You can understand the evolutionary biology and neurochemistry of attachment and still be enchanted by the actual miracle of two separate consciousnesses creating shared meaning and mutual transformation through commitment. The enchantment deepens rather than diminishes when you realize how improbable and fragile and precious it is, how much conscious effort and grace, both your effort and the grace of favorable circumstances it requires to sustain. You're not enchanted by illusion but by truth, by what love actually is rather than what romantic mythology pretends it to be. Suffering, You don't need to believe in karma or divine providence to find meaning in pain. You can understand suffering as the inevitable consequence of being a conscious, embodied, vulnerable creature in an indifferent universe and still experience it as transformative rather than purely destructive. The meaning doesn't come from external cosmic purposes. It comes from how you meet the suffering, what you allow it to teach you, how you let it deepen your compassion or clarify your values or connect you to others who suffer. Weber would call this value rationality operating in the domain of personal meaning-making, choosing to orient towards suffering in ways that align with your deepest commitments, even when the universe provides no guarantee that such orientation will be rewarded. Work. You don't need to believe you're fulfilling divine calling to experience your labor as meaningful. You can understand work as economic necessity and social contribution, and still approach it as craft, as practice, as the domain where you develop mastery and offer your particular gifts to the world. The sacredness doesn't come from supernatural validation. It comes from the integrity with which you engage the work, the care you bring to it, the consciousness you maintain about its relationship to larger human flourishing. This is calling without divine caller, vocation grounded in human values and needs rather than cosmic decree, but no less real or demanding for that. If you can develop this capacity for conscious enchantment, this ability to be genuinely moved and awed and reverently engaged with reality, as it actually is rather than as you wish it were or pretend it to be, you discover something remarkable. The weight of disenchantment doesn't crush you anymore. Not because you've escaped disenchantment through nostalgic return to pre-modern beliefs, but because you've moved through it to something on the other side, to a maturity of consciousness that can sustain meaning without metaphysical guarantees, that can experience wonder without requiring supernatural explanations, that can commit to values while acknowledging their constructed nature, that can bear suffering without theodicy, and pursue calling without divine mandate. This is desperately hard work. It requires what Weber called the strength of personality, the psychological and spiritual fortitude to face reality without the comforts that most people need to function. Most won't manage it. Most will continue oscillating between pure instrumental rationality that leaves them empty and various re-enchantment projects that require belief in things they can't actually credit. But for those who can develop this capacity, who can learn to be enchanted by truth rather than consoled by illusion, a different kind of life becomes possible. Not an easier life, probably a harder one in many ways, because you can't retreat into the numbing mechanisms that make disenchantment bearable for most people. But a richer life, a deeper life, a life adequate to both the demands of rationalized civilization and the hunger of the human soul for meaning and purpose and sacred connection. Weber ends his lecture on science as a vocation with a challenge that still echoes more than a century later. He says that the ultimate question for modern individuals is whether they have the strength to bear their fate, to live authentically in a disenchanted world without either retreating into comfortable illusions or succumbing to nihilistic despair. That question is even more urgent now than when he posed it, because rationalization has advanced far beyond what Weber witnessed, and the temptations to either numbing or false re-enchantment have multiplied exponentially through technologies and ideologies he couldn't have imagined. But so have the possibilities for conscious enchantment. We know more than Weber could have known about consciousness and cosmos and the actual mechanisms through which meaning emerges. We have access to contemplative practices and psychological insights and scientific discoveries that reveal depths of reality Weber could only glimpse. If we can learn to engage those resources not as mere techniques for optimization, but as pathways to genuine encounter with mystery, we might discover forms of enchantment adequate to our circumstances, enchantments that don't require us to deny what we know, but invite us to wonder at what we're discovering. This is the real challenge facing anyone who feels the weight of disenchantment. Not to recover what's lost, which is impossible. Not to resign yourself to permanent emptiness, which is unbearable, but to develop consciousness capable of finding enchantment in truth itself, of being moved by reality as it actually is rather than requiring it to conform to your wishes or fears or inherited mythologies. To live rationally without losing reverence. To see clearly without losing wonder. To accept the absence of cosmic guarantees without surrendering to meaninglessness. To bear your fate, as Weber put it, with dignity and depth and discriminating engagement, rather than with either cynical detachment or desperate self-deception. Can you do this? Can you learn to inhabit the tension between rational clarity and sacred purpose, between honest assessment of a disenchanted world and committed creation of meaning within it? Can you be enchanted by what is true rather than what is comfortable? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're invitations to a specific kind of practice, a discipline of consciousness that Weber pointed toward but didn't fully articulate. And they're the questions that will determine whether you spend your life crushed by the weight of disenchantment or transformed by the possibility of conscious enchantment that lies on the other side of that crushing weight. If you're ready to explore what that transformation might require, if you want to go deeper into how to actually practice conscious enchantment in a rationalized world, I've created another video that takes the next step in this journey. It's called Weber's Iron Cage: How to Live Meaningfully in Systems Designed to Destroy Meaning. And in it I reveal the specific practices and perspectives that can help you maintain sacred purpose while functioning in profoundly disenchanted institutions. You'll find the link in the description. Don't just watch these ideas. Begin applying them. Begin the difficult, beautiful work of becoming someone who can bear reality without illusion and still find it worthy of reverence. That's the path Weber challenges us to walk, and it's the only path I've found that leads anywhere worth going. Until the next awakening.